The title of the thought I want to bring to you today is Stand Up and Be Counted. And eventually I want to get to a very interesting story in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 1 to 20. But before I get there, let me just paint the backdrop, set the scene for this story. The nation of Israel had endured a string of bad kings who had done evil in the sight of Yahweh and had turned Israel away from Yahweh. None more so when they were under the reign of King Ahab and Queen Jezebel. And after such a long time of unfaithfulness on Israel's part, it was time for Yahweh to intervene. The priests and the Levites had fled into Judah, no doubt fearing for their lives. And it would appear that when Israel's kings and priests didn't carry out their appointments righteously and faithfully, that Yahweh would send in the prophets to clear the way, restore faith, and wipe the slate clean again. Enter Elijah. In 1 Kings chapter 17, out of nowhere seemingly, Elijah emerges on the pages of Scripture and he confronts, and not for the last time, King Ahab, telling him that there was going to be no rain or no dew on the land until Elijah said so. After issuing that to Ahab, Yahweh told Elijah to go and wait at the brook Cherith. And there Yahweh was going to meet all of his needs. He was simply to wait and to live there in the shadows, away from the public eye for a while. Cherith is from the Hebrew charath, which means to cut off or cut down. Elijah had burst onto the pages of Scripture from out of obscurity, but from Cherith he was to emerge having been cut off from Israel, from the world, as the man of Yahweh, the man of God. He was to be cut down to size. He was to be cut off from all spiritual activity, except the activity of prayer and waiting. For years he would wake up each morning with the assurance that everything was going to be okay. There was going to be food provided by the ravens, and water would be exclusively his, provided by the brook. But one morning after some time, something was very different. The brook had dried up. The ravens had gone. Was this because Yahweh was displeased with Elijah? Of course not. It was simply a sign from Yahweh to tell Elijah it was time to move on. There is a time and a season for everything under heaven. There is a time for waiting, a time for prayer, a time for listening. But there is also a time for action. And after having waited on Yahweh for so long, it was now time for Elijah to get up from where he was and move further into the plan and purpose of Yahweh for his life. He would soon be on the way to Carmel, which was to be the pinnacle of his faith and his spiritual life and activity, but not before he had to be obedient one more time and go to a place called Zarephath. And there Yahweh had provided a widow woman out of many widows to sustain him during this time by giving him shelter and food. And as Elijah had prophesied to her, the flour jug and the water jar didn't run dry until rain came on the land. The son, however, of this widow woman eventually died. And in the upper room of the house where Elijah was staying, he there witnessed the remarkable power, resurrection life of Yahweh as Yahweh breathed life again into this widow woman's son. There is something to be learned from the secret and the principle of an upper room experience where it's the custom to wait on Yahweh for his presence, his word, his instructions. It was in this place where the power of Yahweh was revealed for Elijah and many others in the Scriptures who have also had an upper room experience. I ask you today, do you have a room such as this? A place where the world is shut out and you are alone with Yahweh. A place where he can reveal himself to you. This upper room was as much the preparation ground for Elijah as was the waiting time at Cherith. The faith and obedience that would be required at Carmel would not have been possible without lessons learned at Cherith and Zarephath. And after 3 years, Elijah was now ready for the most important confrontation and challenge of his life with Ahab and Jezebel, the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Asherah. But not before Elijah had a different type of confrontation with a certain fellow prophet named Obadiah. And this is where we find the story in 1 Kings 18 verse 1 to 20. Yahweh had told Elijah to get up and to go and meet Ahab again. And Elijah was obedient, and in the meantime Ahab had told his servant Obadiah to go to different parts of the country and look for grass for the cattle. Ahab went one way, Obadiah went the other. And in Obadiah's path stood Elijah. And he recognized Elijah and he says, "Is that you, my master?" And Elijah says, "Yes, it is. It's me." And Elijah says, "Go and tell your master Ahab that I am here." And so begins a very interesting dialogue. Obadiah says, "But don't you know, master, that Ahab has sent men into every province and kingdom throughout Israel looking for you. And when they come back and tell Ahab that you're not there, he makes that province and that kingdom swear that they were telling the truth. And now here you're telling me to go and tell Ahab that you are here. When I've gone, the Spirit of Yahweh may just take you somewhere else and you can't be found, and my life will be gone. Don't you know, Elijah, about what I did? When Jezebel was killing the prophets of Yahweh, I hid 100 in caves and I fed them food and water. I have loved Yahweh since my youth, and you're telling me to go to Ahab? And if he comes and you're not here, he will surely kill me." And Elijah says, "As long as Yahweh, that the Lord of the armies, I promise you by his name, I will be here." And so Obadiah went off and told Ahab. Ahab came out to meet Elijah, and he said to Elijah, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" And Elijah says, "I'm not the one who's troubled Israel, but you have. Now go and gather all the prophets of Baal, 450, and the prophets of Asherah, and meet me there on Mount Carmel." So, Obadiah the prophet. Spurgeon had a lot of good things to say about Obadiah, and who am I to contradict this great prince of preachers? But in all honesty, I have mixed feelings about Obadiah. On the surface, he appears to be somebody to be very admired. The scriptures recognize him as a prophet. He had loved Yahweh since his youth, and he still loved Yahweh now and the ancient paths in his adulthood. And when the modern thought of the day was the worship of Baal, to which most of Israel had succumbed, Obadiah had been faithful to the God of his fathers. When Jezebel was killing off the prophets of Yahweh, as Obadiah pointed out to Elijah, he had hidden 100 prophets in 2 caves, providing them food and water, no doubt from Ahab and Jezebel's own table. So many good things to be said about Obadiah, and maybe he really was using his privileged position, like Esther, who came to the kingdom at such a time as this, to help with the preservation of the prophets in the land. It's good to think the best of people, and in the main, this is how I feel about Obadiah. But herein lies my problem, and others who professed faith and allegiance to Yahweh at that time in Israel's history. At a time when Israel needed a warrior, a leader, a commander, an out-and-out example, Obadiah was found to be serving in the house of the most evil king and queen Israel had ever known, instead of serving at the altar of Yahweh. Obadiah's name means servant of Yahweh, but his life was being spent in the service of Ahab. In addition to Obadiah that we know that there were at least 100 remaining prophets in all of Israel. But where were they to be found at this time? But hiding in caves. And where were the 7,000 that Yahweh pointed out to Elijah later on, who had not bowed their knee to Baal? Where were they to be found at this crucial time? At a time when Israel needed a deliverer, a spokesperson, a champion, no one was to be found that was not in isolation, fearing for their lives, Obadiah included. Don't take this the wrong way, Spurgeon and others, but what use was Obadiah, the 100 prophets, the 7,000 when Israel had plummeted into absolute idolatry, rebellion, hopelessness, spiritual apathy and decay? Of what real value and purpose were these men and women behind the curtain instead of being on the public and spiritual stage? It would appear that Obadiah feared more for his life, the preservation of his own life, rather than for the concern and the welfare of Elijah, whom Obadiah knew his master Ahab had been searching for in every kingdom and province in Israel. He didn't seem overly ecstatic to see Elijah at the reappearance of Elijah to Ahab, and he was more displaying a fear of losing his own life for being the one who Elijah had asked to tell Ahab that Elijah was here. It's interesting that Ahab hadn't said to Obadiah, as he had said to Elijah when he saw him again, "Is that you, you troubler of Israel?" Obadiah was seemingly no threat, or represented no trouble to the kingdom of darkness that submerged Israel at that time. And maybe, and I pray it was the case, that it wasn't until after Carmel that Obadiah changed. So, what do I want to say to you about this story today? I believe there is coming a time on this earth and in our nation when Yahweh will be on the lookout for those who are willing to stand up and be counted. Men and women whose hearts are fully committed to Him. Men and women who aren't afraid of the cost to their own lives, who aren't afraid to put the message that's in their heart on their lips without fear or consequence. Fear of consequence. Men and women who aren't afraid to speak up to the most wealthy and powerful. Men and women who are willing to stand in absolute solidarity with Yahweh and the things concerning His kingdom, His word and His will. There is coming a time when there will be no real purpose to Yahweh's children hiding in caves or churches, afraid to be seen and known among those who stand as an affront to Yahweh and the things of His kingdom. Thinking about Israel at that time, collectively, this army of men and women in Israel who still professed faith in Yahweh could have had a major and profound effect on idolatrous Israel, could have made serious noises and indentations to the wayward and backsliding nation. But they didn't come together, rather stayed isolated and afraid behind their secure walls, which was both home and prison to them. They didn't come out into the open and be counted for the sake of Yahweh and His kingdom. Today I believe Yahweh is preparing in the secret place those who are willing and learning to wait for His instructions before acting. Men and women who recognize the voice of Yahweh and are willing to get up and go wherever Yahweh tells them to go, whenever He tells them. These are men and women who will be shining beacons in the kingdom of Yahweh, not afraid to challenge the waywardness and the modern thinking of individuals and churches alike who are leading Yahweh's people astray through modern thinking and philosophy. Men and women who are not afraid to speak or stand up to politicians and governments and kings and queens of our world who should be setting a righteous example but aren't. Could you be that man or that woman? We cannot expect to go to Carmel without first getting a spiritual backbone that comes from the experiences of Cherith and Zarephath. So much more could be said about these chapters and stories found in the book of 1 Kings, but in the interest of time and by way of closing, let it suffice me to say this. Before the fire could come down on Carmel, before the enemies of Yahweh could be exposed and destroyed, before there could be a restoration of faith to Israel, the first thing that Elijah had to do on that mountain was to repair the altar of Yahweh. The altar of Yahweh represents so many things. It speaks of worship, it speaks of death, it speaks of sacrifice, it speaks of a declaration of faith from the creature to the creator, it speaks of covenant and obedience, and I could go on. And I ask you today, is the altar of Yahweh broken down in your heart? Is the altar of Yahweh broken down in your church or in your nation? Is it in need of repair? It will soon be time for those who are prepared, equipped, anointed, and unafraid, remember Gideon's army, to stand up, consider the cost, and be among those who are counted, who have not and will not bow the knee to modern Baalism, that is the religion and the systems of this world that are not aligned to the true worship and service of Yahweh. It will soon be time for such prepared ones to get up and rebuild and repair the true altar of Yahweh in our lands and in our churches. It will soon be time for men and women to become true champions of the faith, like Elijah, like Elisha, like David, like Daniel, and so many others. The faithful remnants of Israel. Thank you for listening. Have a good rest of the day, and Yahweh go with you.